In earlier sections, we had talked about the reconquest in Iberia, the 700-year effort for the Christian peoples to expel the Muslim invaders who had come in 711. That process, as we talked about, had finally concluded in 1492 when Ferdinand and Isabella had finally conquered the last Muslim stronghold at Granada, and now that reconquest, that taking of all of Spanish territory back to the Christians has now been completed, and that's going to open the door for Isabella especially to take a look at some of the ideas of how she could stabilize and enrich her kingdom. Now, it's well known that the Portuguese have been increasingly profiting from their overseas trade throughout the 1460s and 70s and 80s. This is not, any secret. The Portuguese are more and more successful in exploring further and further down the coastline of Africa and bringing in more resources. If Spain, if now Ferdinand and Isabella, if they could get into the business of overseas expansion and overseas exploration, essentially, Africa has kind of been shut down in the sense that the Portuguese have already done what they've done there. They've set up military bases, and they can kind of lay claim to what's going on there, all right? That's where someone like Columbus can come in, all right? It's pretty obvious for most thinking people by the late Middle Ages that the Earth is round. It doesn't take a rocket scientist. You can just be a humble human being standing on a cliff near the water, near the ocean on a day where there's a ship sailing straight at you, and you can see the curvature of the Earth, right? You can see first the mast, then the sails, and then the whole ship itself. This is common knowledge amongst mariners. They have no illusions about this, okay? There are some people who are holding the royal courts hostage through an older science, an understanding of a flat Earth, but that's a whole other issue. Columbus is pretty sure the Earth is round. Other people, for example, in the time period of the Hellenistic era, that time period after Alexander the Great, some very early Hellenistic science had established the Earth as round as well. Their projections of what size the Earth was were off a little bit, but nonetheless, they were proven and thought that the Earth was round. Exactly how big or how small is an issue. Columbus, knowing what he knows about various sciences, about the ideas of other sailors, having traveled many different places, and having talked in conversations with other sailors who talk about sailing, there's pretty clear evidence that he has gathered enough information to figure out that it may sound crazy, but we'll get back to the idea, that he could sail directly west and end up in the Far East. Now, on a globe, okay, that's a potential thing. But if the Earth is flat, of course, it's a ridiculous notion. But he is going to be setting off, having tried this idea. He had approached other royal families in Europe about this kind of idea. They had not found it interesting and had dismissed it. Isabel is willing, and she does this. She has him on retainer. He's given some funds in advance of 1492 to kind of stick around. And once 1492 comes around, she is able then to find the financing and the stability to test his idea. Now, Columbus himself is a bit of an anomaly. He was very careful at kind of hiding his background. He used to write often in Latin, not in his native vernacular language, whatever it was. I mean, on some elements, as you look at the history of Columbus, there's some elements sort of like of a con man in what he's trying to do or say. Some of it seems to be a little too good to be true. But here's the issue. Knowing that the Portuguese are in the lead, the Spanish now, Isabella especially, of Castile-Leon, she needs to, if she's going to do this, break out. She has to take a lead, and she has to take something different. The Portuguese already lead. She has to take a bold step and see if she can go around it. Now, Columbus has been pretty savvy about understanding sailing, wind and water cycles, and is well known by late medieval Europe that, for example, when, say, the harbor in Copenhagen, Denmark, is frozen shut during the winter, even further north towards the Arctic Circle and places along the Norwegian coastline like Narvik and Trondheim are not nearly as iced in, which seems kind of strange. A place further north would have less ice, but there's also well-known understandings among sailors that right off the coast of Africa, a lot of wind and water seems to shoot directly west, and then to the northern part of Europe, a bunch of wind and water that is relatively warm comes out of the south and west. Now, a simple bit of triangulation here would lead you to believe, if you think about it, that something is deflecting all that wind and water. That wind and water just don't shoot off the African coast and go into nothing, and then this wind and water somehow shows up off the coast of Norway. Well, in this case, you already have solved for 2 of the 3, and you can just solve the third. Columbus then will be going west to get to the east. But before he goes, he will have a contract outlined with Isabella of Castile, where he's going to be in for the profit. He's in for 10% of their royal 20%. Remember the royal quinta, the royal 20% that the Iberian monarchs get in import taxes? Columbus has asked for 10% of their 20%, if that makes sense. He also, though, is having several titles that are granted to him. Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Governor, Viceroy. On one level, it seems kind of silly to ask for titles that are kind of empty. But on one hand, the monarchs can grant them to Columbus because he's now going to be their delegated authority in whatever territories he finds. If he finds nothing, they've lost nothing. If he finds something, then he can be used as their royal servant. For Columbus, it gives him great status. For example, something like the title of admiral in traditional Castilian history is usually given to somebody who's closely related to the royal family, if not royal themselves. Columbus needs that stature, he needs that status. So he has a contract, he's going to be helping the state here by whatever they find, the wealth is going to go back into the royal family. And so he makes 4 separate voyages, and here's a simple map showing them in a color-coded fashion. The first one in 1492, and then there's others that come after it. In all 4 of his voyages, he's going to be going a slightly different route, encountering different wind and water cycles, finding some of the dead spots in the way the winds work at different times. I mean, as a mariner, he's going to be exploring and experimenting with the best way to get from point A to point B. Along the way, also, he's going to start giving lots of European names to many of the islands he starts to see. And it's, remember, no coincidence that he sets off in August and lands in what we know as the Bahamas in October. For those of us who live in America, that's peak hurricane season. That's the peak time period when the wind and water cycle shooting off the African coast heads straight basically for the Caribbean. Columbus is starting to win, he's understanding the wind and water cycle, right? He didn't leave in January. He didn't leave in November. He set sail when the winds were at their strongest, okay? So he is going to be the one who's going to use that basic knowledge, that basic understanding, and find the New World. Now remember, when he arrives here, he's convinced he's in India. Because from the readings he has understood from people who've traveled to India, finding out what their latitude is, how far they are between the equator and the North Pole, he sees that the readings for India are the same as the Bahamas, and so he's going to start to call all the people there Indians. He's going to refer to will increasingly refer to many of the islands of the Caribbean as the West Indies, right? So we pick up on this name of the misnomer, the total misunderstanding. Columbus is not in India. He thinks he is, but now he has beaten the Portuguese in the sense that they have found a way to get directly to new worlds and explore possible places for great wealth. Columbus is convinced that he is on the edge of Japan and China. He will, of course, in time be proven wrong, but he holds on to that idea for quite some time because people cannot fathom having this totally new series of continents, North, Central, and South America, just sitting there in the way on the way to East Asia. All right? Take a look at your book and how they're going to outline some of the ideas of Columbus, the idea that he was motivated by gold and lots of other issues, but also the key development here that for Isabella, this was a risk. She was putting some resources into a man, Columbus, who was kind of an unknown quantity. He had some elements of being a con man, was a little bit shifty, but nonetheless, in the end, he came through. He found what they thought was India, but turned out to be the New World. And if you want to know the end of the story, Columbus's descendants were cheated, the contract was not enforced, things like that happen. Take a look at your reading, make sure you have a clear understanding of what Columbus was doing, and then take a look and see if there's some sample questions to assist you in understanding this time period.